Okay, so welcome to today's webinar. My name is Victoria Winkler and I'm Director of the Bevan Foundation. The Bevan Foundation is Wales's most influential think tank. We're a charity, we're independent from government, we're funded by a mix of trusts and foundations and also by organisations with subscriptions and individual donations. We thought it would be a good idea to have today's webinar because the white paper on housing has been long and very keenly awaited. It's a bit of a truism to say that we face a housing crisis in Wales, and yet every day the number of people who are living in temporary accommodation, the number of people facing eviction from their homes, the number of people presenting as homeless is increasing. The white paper followed the earlier green paper, which promised a great deal in terms of changes to our housing legislation, policy and practice. We're here today and I'm really pleased to be joined by Einion Dafydd and by Lily Thompson to talk about the contents of the white paper, and then with responses from Ruth Power from Shelter Cymru and Back the Bill and Darren Baxter from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation to provide comment and perhaps some challenge on some of the things in the white paper. The session will fall pretty much into two halves. So we're going to be looking at affordable housing, what we mean by it in the first half, and then we're going to move on and look at issues around rents in the second half. At the end of each half, if that makes sense, we'll have an opportunity for questions and discussion. And when we come to that point, I'd really encourage you to put your comments in the Q&A box. So we've got a lot to get through. We're going to finish by 3:30, but on the way, we've got 4 great speakers, as well as input from you in the audience. So without further ado, I'd like to look at the question, the overview of the white paper's proposals on adequate housing with Einion Dafydd from Welsh Government. And my colleague Caroline's going to share his slides.
Yeah, thank you very much, Victoria, and thank you all for making the time today to discuss the white paper on housing adequacy and fair rents. So the white paper is presented in 2 parts on 2 issues that are closely linked. Affordability is the golden thread running through both parts of the paper, and I'll discuss the first part of the white paper on housing adequacy, and then my colleague Lily will discuss the second part of the white paper on affordability and fair rents, and then in between Ruth and Darren will comment with a perspective from outside government. But to start, I'll set out some background. So in 2021, as part of the cooperation agreement between Plaid Cymru and Labour, the government committed to exploring whether legislation should be made to give people in Wales a legal right to adequate housing. And we published a white paper on these topics in 2023, undertook a consultation exercise on the green paper, and we drew on responses to the green paper as we developed the white paper. So the white paper has been informed by the green paper, but also by ongoing engagement with stakeholders, including through the external stakeholder advisory group that we set up specifically to support the work on the green and white papers. And then in terms of the purpose of a white paper is a statement of the government's intention to make legislation in a particular area. In white papers, we set out our thinking on a particular issue, and we present concrete proposals. And then we ask members of the public and organisations to respond to questions. And we published this white paper on the 24th of October. And so we're now in that consultation period where people can respond to the questions set out in the document, and the consultation will run until the close of play on Friday this week, so 31st of January. We're very keen to get feedback from stakeholders. One of the great things about making policy in Wales is that we're very close to stakeholders, and we're very interested in getting stakeholder input, especially with the questions that we've asked. But in terms of the government's position on this issue, the starting point for understanding the government's position is that it's a key ambition of the government to ensure everyone in Wales has a decent, affordable and safe place to call home. The principle that everyone has a right to an adequate home is one the government wholeheartedly supports, and this is reflected in the white paper. We fully recognise that good quality, affordable housing can provide opportunities for every individual and family. It can have a positive impact on health, on educational outcomes, and on well-being more generally. And we feel that the white paper is an important step in achieving this ambition because it sets out proposals for the development of a long-term housing strategy to provide a clear, measurable framework to support the delivery of housing adequacy for all. And so the white paper is another significant step forward on our progressive journey towards delivering housing adequacy for everyone in Wales. So the white paper considers the feasibility of making legislation to give people in Wales a legal right to adequate housing. And the first step is to define adequate housing and consider how we could identify whether or not housing is adequate in a particular case. We draw on a framework presented by the UN's Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. And this framework is based on 7 factors or 7 criteria, factors of housing adequacy, as set out on this slide, the top half of this slide. So if all of these criteria are fulfilled, then we can consider that housing adequacy applies in a particular case. So legal security of tenure, availability of services, materials, facilities and infrastructure, affordability, habitability, accessibility, location and cultural adequacy. So for example, with affordability, housing would not be adequate if the costs of housing, rent for example, threatens or compromises the occupants' enjoyment of other human rights such as food. If they had to spend so much on their housing that they couldn't afford basic necessities, then we would not consider that to be adequate housing. Then with habitability, housing would not be adequate if it didn't guarantee physical safety, if it didn't provide adequate space, if it didn't provide protection against the cold, damp, heat, rain, wind, or any other threats to health. And of course, if there were structural hazards present, then of course it would not fulfill the requirement there. So in terms of the suitability, the appropriateness of this framework, we set out in the white paper that it is a promising framework, but there would need to be considerable work undertaken to develop the framework before it could be applied in practice. The framework in its present form doesn't provide the tools and the methods we would need to identify whether the criteria are fulfilled in the case of a specific individual or a family. It doesn't give us. We would need to develop the framework quite considerably so that we can measure and look at specific cases. Then the white paper discusses 2 concepts that are relevant in this context, in the context of the 7 factors of housing adequacy. And these 2 concepts are minimum core and progressive realisation. And the idea with the minimum core is that governments should ensure that a minimum level of standard is met on each of these 7 factors. So the government would need to set minimum standards for each of those factors. And the UN guidance makes it clear that it would be for every country to define the minimum core levels itself. So that would be something that would need to be taken into account if any legislation were to be made. Then progressive realisation acknowledges that adequate housing may not be realised immediately. It may be realised over time. And it's not expected to be something that a government would just be able to deliver. And again, that's something that stems from the UN guidance as well. So the UN, they recognise that this is a legitimate approach for introducing a right to adequate housing, that you progressively realise legislation over time, rather than expecting that everything is in place immediately. And it's widely accepted across the country, across the sector in Wales, that housing adequacy can't be delivered overnight. So if we look at this framework and how we can draw on this framework, according to this framework, then the aim is to deliver that minimum core, that minimum level of standard progressively over time. So in terms of the framework's value, we believe the UN's framework provides a helpful basis for understanding what constitutes housing adequacy. And so we believe there is a role for this framework to play in informing our work as we develop a long-term strategy for Wales, a strategy which has as its core the aim of delivering adequate housing for everyone in Wales. We've noted in the white paper that concerns have been raised or were raised in response to the green paper. Some respondents to the green paper consultation exercise, including local authorities, did raise concerns about the feasibility of delivering adequate housing. Some shared concerns that making legislation before the housing stock was there would place burdens on the sector, and burdens that people would know from the outset that could not be met. And there are also concerns about the level of funding required to be able to deliver adequate housing, concerned about the timelines, the implementation timelines, when would these targets need to be met, and concerns about the availability of the workforce as well. So in the white paper, we've also drawn on international examples, evidence from other countries that have taken steps to make legislation in this area. We note that the evidence is very much mixed. So South Africa, for example, is a country where there are strong legal rights, but the lack of supply is a big problem there. And then France is a country where legislation has been made, but the effectiveness of that legislation has been called into question. So more positive evidence from Finland. So the international picture is mixed, but we have drawn on evidence from overseas. And we've also set out all those actions that we've taken in Wales to make progress with delivering adequate housing. So in terms of our proposals that we set out in the white paper, the focus is very much on the steps we want to take, or we think need to be taken to support delivery of adequate housing. It's an approach that responds to the particular challenges faced by people across Wales and to the context of the Welsh housing sector specifically. And responding to those concerns I mentioned earlier about voiced by stakeholders about the ability of the sector to deliver housing adequacy in the medium term. So we believe the focus in the short to medium term should be on making further progress in terms of increasing the capacity of the housing sector in Wales to provide adequate housing. The white paper does acknowledge that there could be a time when making legislation to provide the right to adequate housing is the appropriate approach, and that option will be kept under review. But we believe that our focus today should be on delivering more affordable homes, improving the housing stock, supporting affordability, and ending homelessness. So with this in mind, we propose to develop legislation during the next Senedd term to establish a framework that will drive forward action for delivering adequate housing. So in terms of what the legislation could do, it could place a duty on Welsh ministers to provide a housing strategy within a defined timescales. And that could be a strategy specifically to address housing adequacy. The legislation could set out 7 factors that need to be captured within such a strategy, and it could also set out how we would define them. It could outline requirements regarding the development of indicators and monitoring practices to see whether we are achieving housing adequacy. It could also identify who needs to be involved and consulted on the production of such a housing strategy. If the legislation is made, then you would expect the government to publish a housing strategy, but you would also expect the government to undertake a regular review of the strategy. So the legislation could set out the timescales in which that would be expected. And then the legislation could also provide for accountability by setting out the mechanisms for monitoring how delivery against the strategy will take place, how the reporting process would work, including potentially putting in place provisions for Welsh ministers to report progress to the Senedd. But I think the key point of significance, I think, when it comes to future legislation is that it could place a duty on defined public sector bodies to have regard to the housing strategy in discharging their housing functions. And that could be a very significant step, as it would place a high moral obligation on public sector partners to act in ways consistent with delivering adequate housing. So I think I'll leave it there for now. I think I'm about to run out of time, but very much looking forward to the response from Ruth and also your questions later. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Anion. I think that was a really clear talk through the main provisions of the Housing White Paper, and also a good explanation as to how you've got to where the paper is. And I'm sure lots of different organisations have their own view. I think if I was to summarise your position, it would be rights later. And I think if I was to summarise what Ruth is likely to argue, without putting words into her mouth, it would be rights now. So rather than hog the conversation, I'm going to hand over to Ruth to set out her views about what's in the white paper.
I think you've covered it, Victoria. No, thank you both. This is a moment when I perhaps regret not having slides and speak to you for 10 minutes. So I'm going to just give you a brief kind of history of the Back the Bill campaign, say a little bit about where we are now, and then, give the campaign's group's reflections on whether the white paper goes far enough, with a particular focus on rights. The campaign, I should say, is Shelter Cymru, Tai Pawb and Chartered Institute of Housing Cymru. We're the three organisations that came together in 2019 and formed the Back the Bill campaign. Before I kind of outline the history of the Back the Bill campaign, I just wanted to start with a quote from one of our Take Notice project members. So Take Notice is a lived experience project, which is under the auspices of Shelter Cymru. Its members have lived experience of homelessness. So one of the quotes that was shared with me, and I think is incredibly powerful and speaks to the right to adequate housing, is the one I'm going to share with you. I was so ashamed when I had to ask for help. I never thought I would be someone who had to go cap in hand to the council. If I thought I had a right to a home, it wouldn't be so shameful. Nobody's ashamed of getting free treatment at the doctors because we all expect it and know we're entitled to it. So I suppose that kind of speaks to universal rights really mattering to people. They don't just promote access to the fundamentals of life, like healthcare, like homes, but they tell us about the kind of nation that we live in, and they give people a sense of dignity. They give people a sense of our kind of common humanity. So moving on to a sort of a brief history of the campaign. For those that are not familiar with it, when the campaign came together, the right to adequate housing was already an obligation in the UK under the auspices of the International Convention on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights that UK is a signatory to. But we were failing to deliver in terms of those obligations. Some of the groundwork that the campaign has done to get to the stage where the right to adequate housing was included in the cooperation agreement in the way that Anion outlined. So the groundwork we did to get to that stage was a feasibility study and a draft bill looking at introducing the right in Wales, which was undertaken by Professor Simon Hoffman of Swansea University. We commissioned independent research from Alma Economics, which looked at international learning, which we think is incredibly valuable, and does just that. It gives us learning upon which we can build in Wales about the experiences of other country and some of the key underpinnings that we need to take care of in Wales as we move forward, we hope, towards that right. And Alma Economics also undertook a cost-benefit analysis. So using a standard Treasury methodology, they showed that for every pound there was a return of £2.30 in realising a right to adequate housing, and that those returns would begin to accrue within 5 years of introducing the right. And then lastly, there's a routes map the campaign has produced, which if you want something to support your understanding, but also to support implementation, that route map is a useful resource. So in terms of where we are now, so I suppose there's a wide consensus that home is a moral right, and that consensus, holds true across political parties. But what's been really clear, and Victoria touched on this in her introduction, is that kind of moral consensus has not been enough to give home the primacy that it needs within political debate, within policy and budget making, or we wouldn't be where we are now. We've had decades of underinvestment. We've had a lack of clear vision for the whole housing system in Wales, and there's been a lack of long-term planning for our housing system. And all of that has contributed to a Wales where a suitable home, an affordable home, is a bit of a pipe dream for many people. We've got social housing waiting lists, which are now pushing towards 100,000 households in Wales. Victoria touched on the unprecedented levels of homelessness. Private rents have lost touch with people's incomes. We at Shelter Cymru, amongst the many people come to us for help, now see more people with mortgages seeking our help to keep their homes. So despite what we know are the best efforts of many of us right across the housing system, working in different roles in different kinds of organisations, and the efforts and some of the progressive legislation that has been brought forward by government, despite all that, there's an enormous strain on the system. There's a risk that we enter a new normal where children living in temporary accommodation are a feature of classrooms across Wales. So I suppose in that context, it's not surprising at all that support for the right to adequate housing is building. So public support even a few years back was 77% of public in the YouGov poll were in support of the right. 2/3 of the chief execs of housing associations in Wales are supporting the right. Charities like Care and Repair, Llamau, Amnesty are supporting the right. And in a recent Senedd debate, MSs from across political parties showed their support for the right as well. So that's a little bit about where we feel we are now. And I'm now just going to say a little bit about the white paper itself and whether it goes far enough. So firstly, it's really important to say that we do certainly welcome various references in the white paper. So the references to improving housing adequacy, the reference to the UN 7 goals for housing adequacy, those are very welcome. The need for long-term planning, the need for change is welcomed. Having said that, the proposal of a housing strategy just in itself points to the fact that home hasn't benefited from the kind of political attention that is merited, really. It's disappointing that we're in such a position in Wales for such a fundamental requirement as a home. And in that regard, I suppose the ambition of the white paper is really limited. The limits of having a strategy is an ambition of a white paper, albeit that a cross-tenure long-term strategy would in itself be a useful addition. As a campaign, we're very rights-focused, and that's why we're calling for legislating for right to adequate housing, not legislating for a strategy. Legislating for the right would give confidence that Welsh Government is ready to commit to the reset that we need in our approach to home in a way that a strategy doesn't. Legislating for a right is a really powerful way of articulating how we conceive as home, reframing home as a human right rather than as a financial asset in our domestic law will guide a very different approach to policy making by this government and future governments. It would make a really strong commitment to the kind of society that we want, where people's ability to thrive isn't undermined by homelessness or inadequate housing, much in the way we conceive of universal access to healthcare. And what a right would do is hardwire it. So we'd hardwire it as a foundational mission of government. So the governments of any colour in the future would need to pay regard to that and ensure that they progressively realise that right year after year, Senedd term after Senedd term, regardless of change of governments. So it'd be much less vulnerable to change in political priorities and much less vulnerable to short-term political thinking. Legislating for the right moves us beyond this consensus around moral rights, around principles, and it just moves us forward to a commitment in law that requires action by government. And specifically, it requires action until that goal is realised. So the goal of a right to adequate housing is an adequate home for everyone in Wales. That's the end point. It sets a very clear end destination. The legal requirements, so the legal duty to progressively realise that comes with a right to adequate housing in law, would drive governments in a non-negotiable way, persistently and incrementally, to deliver on adequate housing. We absolutely accept it would take time. That's what progressive realisation is all about, and it requires no falling back, so no regression in our progress towards that adequacy. So a current situation where, for example, governments specify perhaps a particular number of homes are going to be realised during the course of a Senedd term would no longer be enough. It would require that long-term plan to set out how those steps to adequacy would be taken in the short, medium and the long term to reach that end destination. And helpfully, the right to adequate housing also embeds in it attention first being given to those who are most vulnerable. So those precariously housed, for example, rough sleepers would be likely to fall into that category. And the right to adequate housing also drives early focus on housing inequality. So we know we've got really persistent housing inequalities in Wales. You know, amongst many of the examples I would give would be the absolutely appalling lack of accessible accommodation that we've got and the discrimination that people with disabilities face in housing. So another sort of key element of right to adequate housing, as I say, we've referenced the complexity to it. It provides an internationally recognised pathway as well towards realising that right. So the learning that is available internationally, we think, would also be the benefit as government carves its particular way, the way that suits Wales, towards realising that right. And although there are opportunities for accountability, which Anion has referred to, legislating would provide for stronger non-judicial and judicial mechanisms for individuals and communities to hold government to account. It empowers individuals and communities. So legislating for the right will drive housing and homelessness up the political agenda of all future governments. It would give it higher policy and budgetary priority. And it's shocking to realise that since 2006, an average of just 2.2% of Welsh Government budget has been allocated to housing. That doesn't feel like it matches the attention that the public would give to such a pivotal issue. So in conclusion, in our response, we will welcome some steps forward in the white paper. We will note our concerns that the white paper doesn't reflect the existing international obligations that already are on Wales in respect of housing adequacy. We will note our concerns it doesn't commit more ambitiously to that kind of radical step change that a right to adequate housing drives. And we're concerned that it doesn't give the hope, it doesn't give the confidence that we all need, that future generations in Wales will inherit a better housing legacy than we have today. So we will be calling on Welsh Government to give further consideration to incorporating the rights into law during the Senedd term. We will be asking government to commit itself and future governments in law to planning a path towards the end goal that matters. The only end goal that matters is a Wales where everyone can rely upon an adequate home. So lastly, I would just say this is our campaign. We talk about it as being our NHS moment. In 1947, we didn't talk about needing more hospitals, more doctors, getting all the nurses in place before we legislated for the NHS. We know there aren't any easy solutions to the housing emergency. We know progress will take time. But we are looking for the political courage to take the first step to turn that moral consensus into a legal right that will kind of hardwire the foundations for a different housing future in Wales. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Ruth, and all without slides too. We're really grateful for that. We've got now some time for questions and discussion. There's already a question come in, but do please use the Q&A box to submit your questions. But while you're typing, I'm going to take the liberty of asking both our contributors so far a bit of a tough question each. So bear with me while you type away. So I'm going to start off with Einion. Why do we need legislation for the Welsh Government to produce a strategy? Surely that's something that's in its gift anyway.
Yeah, so I think the idea wouldn't. So sometimes we make legislation to give ministers the right to take a certain action. So otherwise, there are instances when ministers can't do what they would like to do because they don't have the legal basis for doing that. In this instance, that's not the dynamic at play. The dynamic at play here is to ensure that there is in the system that accountability that drives forward the production and delivery of strategy. So it would require ministers to take the action. So I think Ruth said, at a couple of times, I think the logic with Ruth's argument is that by legislating for something, you're forcing the government, successive governments, to take action, whether they want to do that or not. You're kind of putting that pressure in the system to push them in the direction that you want them to take. And I think that's the idea here, is to make sure that this isn't something that we produce a document that sits on a shelf and nobody thinks about it ever again. And then if another government in 10 years wants to produce another document, well, they can if they would like to. So this directs every successive government, potentially, depending on the timescales, to produce a strategy and then for there to be reporting requirements to the Senedd. And so you're building that kind of accountability into the system as well. And of course, the legislation could be quite prescriptive. It could say the housing strategy must have as its aim delivery of adequate housing, and local named public authorities must have an obligation placed on them to take all actions they can to fulfill it. So all of a sudden, this legislation that we're proposing to develop next term could look, 2 or 3 different ways, but there is a version of it which could be quite strongly worded.
Okay. I think perhaps the debate really is about the means. But just to say to the 60 plus people on the call, do please pop your questions in the box. We've got one coming up, but first I want to put Ruth's tough question, which is, you mentioned that the right to adequate housing is already incorporated in UK legislation. And yet I think we see as much of a housing crisis elsewhere in the UK as we do in Wales. So what persuades you that incorporating the right into Welsh legislation would make a difference?
Yeah, so UK has kind of ratified the relevant UN treaty. That's the position at the moment. It's not incorporated into domestic legislation in the UK. What we are seeking is the incorporation in domestic law in Wales in order to provide that much stronger focus and ownership, I suppose, in relation to the obligations that we are already signatories to under those UK arrangements. Legislation from our point of view is really important because of the kind of right spaces that I set out, and I suppose our ultimate ambition for that legislation, the way the campaign foresee it, is that in the early years we make use of that due regard duty, where that sort of pressure refers to on government is there in order to progressively realise through a human rights lens, which is an absolutely vital part of that shift to being guided by the UN right to adequate housing. But in the longer term, we would foresee, and we talk about a sunrise clause, that when we are in a stronger position, we foresee an individual justiciable right, but we don't foresee introducing that initially. We think there is time required to kind of progress to a certain stage, and obviously the exact framing of any right to adequate housing will be based on consultation. So we are campaigning for the introduction of the right. What that right looks like in Wales will be determined by government in consultation with a wide range of stakeholders. But yeah, we consider that rights matter. The legislating for the right matters in domestic law, because people can exercise their rights under domestic law.
Okay, I mean, one of the questions that's come in is more of a comment, really, but the contributor says that on page 43 of the white paper, it says the Welsh Government acknowledges there could be benefits to making further legislation in the future to support people into adequate housing once there is greater availability of adequate housing, which is an admission of the scale of the problem at the moment. And the contributor says that a bill, as you've just said, Ruth, a bill could contain a sunrise clause to give public authorities sufficient time to put the mechanisms in place and agree on criteria to gather and analyse the data. And then the question is, shouldn't the right to housing Shouldn't a Right to Housing Act, shape a strategy rather than following the strategy? And there's then a comment about the NHS. So I think that's possibly one for you, Anian. I mean, is it right that, have we got it the right way round, or have we put the cart before the horse?
Well, I think there are simply two different views on this issue. So I think the priority, the Welsh Government would say that its priority is to deliver adequate housing. And then the headline, what some other people are focusing in the initial stage is a right to adequate housing. They're two different things. They're slightly two different approaches. I'm sure the other side would say that it's a means to an end, a right to adequate housing. But I think for us, we would see, that what we need to do is to be delivering the housing rather than delivering the right in the first place, because ultimately, legislation isn't in and of itself going to get more houses built. And what people across the country want to see is more houses. That's their immediate need, rather than civil servants and politicians perhaps focusing too much on things that won't affect them immediately, even though that might affect them down the line in the medium to long term. So I think the government has been quite clear in the white paper that we're trying to focus on the delivery of the adequate housing rather than on legislation that might not immediately be of much help to people, because sunrise clause would need to come into effect at some point for the legislation to have to take effect or to have an impact on people, and that might not be for a long time.
Okay, thank you. I'm keen to get through the questions that have come in. I'm going to jump to one from another contributor, and I put this to Ruth, if you don't mind. And that contributor says, I can see how legislation could help in holding the feet of future governments to the fire. But what more could be done by the current government to deal with today's crisis? Ruth first.
Wow, that feels like a whole webinar of its own. I suppose in brief, I would say what more could be done. I suppose it's the distinction, making a very clear distinction between dealing with the immediate pressures and having a clear strategy for the immediate pressures that we have now, in terms of the pressures, for example, on temporary accommodation, etc. We published a report recently, for example, looking at the rising costs of temporary accommodation and the demands that is placing upon local authority budgets, as well as upon the human misery associated with it. So a very clear strategy in terms of temporary accommodation and deal with the immediate pressures that people are facing in terms of housing need, sitting alongside a long-term approach. And I think striking that balance, I suppose, would be the key thing between the short term and the long term. And I suppose we are quite concerned at the moment that from a kind of the political context, there's very much a focus now on short-term delivery, which may well work in certain policy areas, but certainly in terms of housing and homelessness is not an approach that's going to serve us well. So we need to be doing a balance of thinking in terms of both the short and the long term about how we move forwards from where we are. And if I could just comment on sort of Anian's response earlier, I suppose what we're looking for in the campaign is that paradigm shift. So I think that our conversations go round in circles in a very small budget envelope with a very defined priority place in which housing and homes and homelessness fits within the thinking of government. As I said, 2.2% average over since 2006. You know, that says it all in terms of our immediate priorities for our First Minister. Homes and homelessness is not at the top of that priority list. So actually, we're looking for that paradigm shift by legislating for right to adequate housing and defining it as a human right, which pushes it up the priority list, which strengthens the arm of the Cabinet Secretary for housing around the Cabinet table to get the resources required, and enables it to be considered to have parity alongside other important policy areas like health, like education, and to be taken far more seriously as underpinning many of the ambitions that many of us would share for you know, for the nation and for people in Wales, and for the well-being particularly of people in Wales with that kind of future gens orientated way of thinking.
I mean, it seems to me that it's actually quite a big ask of a government to legislate for something that boxes itself in, which forces it to do certain things. So, I mean, I get that may well. I'm not asking anyone to comment, but that may well be why we've got the legislation for a strategy rather than legislation about the right. I don't know. Let me just check. There's one more question come in, which says, Professor Simon Hoffman has produced a helpful guide about human rights and touches on the issues raised in my question. And then we've got another comment here, which is, I'm not quite sure who to put this to, but the comment here is, how does this fit with the UN's recent report, for example, Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the UK government, saying the UK government has violated disability rights? Would this change with regards to housing and disability if it was put into legislation? I'm not quite sure. I mean, Einion, do you want to comment, or Ruth?
Yeah, so issues relating to the UK government, it wouldn't be appropriate for me to say too much about that. But in terms of, you know, disability, I think adequate housing, one would expect that to mean adequate for the person in question, isn't it? So, you know, it's not, if you were making legislation to provide everyone with adequate housing, then we would definitely be looking to take into account the needs of the individuals. Just to take a step back, in case this is my last chance to make a contribution, of course, we are here in with the views of the government and then the views of one of the stakeholders as well. And I wouldn't want to give the impression that the government isn't taking the right to the idea of a right to adequate housing seriously. I think the white paper really does take that idea seriously. I think the white paper has really looked at the idea and tried to think of it in a very realistic way about what would need to be done if we were to put this into legislation. So I don't think the white paper dismisses the idea, and I think the white paper is quite genuine in looking at the idea and see what steps would need to be taken before we could make progress in that area. So yeah, and you know, it's not something that has been ruled out in the long term.
Okay, Ruth, do you want a final comment?
Briefly on the question of rights, I suppose I'm not an expert in human rights, but the question points to the interrelationship between rights. So if we have a right to adequate housing, it supports realisation of rights for disabled people. It supports things like realisation of the rights of the child, for example. So it's important to think holistically about the human rights. And in terms of a final comment, I suppose I would say, if Welsh Government believes that you know, the right to adequate housing you know, is an important principle, is an important sort of ambition that it wants to realise over time, I suppose we would encourage them not to be fearful of making that commitment and moving forward with the right, because progressive realisation allows for all of the learning and gradual progress that has been described as so important.
Thank you. I feel a campaign for a sunrise clause coming on. And we're going to go on to look at what's basically the second half of the white paper, which looks at proposals for fair rent. And I'm really pleased we've been joined by Lily Thompson from Welsh Government, who's going to talk us through the provisions of the white paper, with Caroline managing the slides. Brilliant, thank you, Caroline. And then Darren Baxter from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation is going to come in after Lily and talk about what's happening elsewhere in the UK, which we sometimes forget about. And again, as before, we're going to have a quarter of an hour for questions and discussion. Can I thank Ainion and Ruth for their powerful contributions, and now hand over to Lily.
Thank you very much, Victoria. So this section of the white paper explores the shorter to medium term proposals to improve towards the factors of housing adequacy in the private rented sector specifically. If I could have the next slide, please, Caroline. Thank you. So as Ainion outlined in his presentation, this white paper was a programme for government commitment, and we published a green paper consultation in June of 2023, which supported the development of this white paper. The green paper sought evidence and views on different approaches to improving affordability in the private rented sector, which also included views on rent controls. The key evidence from the green paper outlined that a key challenge to creating affordability interventions in the private rented sector is the lack of data available on actual rental costs as opposed to the asking prices for new rentals, as the asking price for new rentals often differs from the actual amount of rent paid. Additionally, regarding the views on rent control models, from the evidence received to the green paper and also further research on the effectiveness of rent controls, the evidence indicated that rent control measures would likely be ineffective without clear data on market rents, and it wouldn't be possible without this data, to identify where these affordability challenges exist. Additionally, there was also evidence that rent control measures could have a detrimental impact on tenants in the private rented sector due to the potential consequence of a reduction of supply in rental properties, or also potentially, if a rent control cap was put in place, the market could respond by moving to meet this cap every year, which could also potentially see tenants in the private rented sector worse off. So therefore, the Welsh Government in this white paper outlined the intention not to take forward rent control measures at this time. However, instead, looking at the need to improve data, the white paper outlines our proposals on how to improve localised rent data across the private rented sector. In this section on improving data on market rents, the white paper explores a proposal to create a method for landlords and agents to share rent information on their properties. This should achieve a larger sample of rent information and therefore providing a stronger data set over time. Evidence from the green paper outlines support on providing data on rent, and several respondents to the green paper suggested that Rent Smart Wales, in its role as the licensing and registration authority, could collect this data on rents. We also see an additional benefit on this, and so we are keen to explore the possibility of establishing a data sharing agreement between Rent Smart Wales and rent officers who collect information on rents for the purpose of calculating the local housing allowance rates. The white paper outlines that the purpose of collecting data on rents including the potential for making rent information publicly available via Rent Smart Wales. We propose that Rent Smart Wales could create a publicly available spatial map of anonymised average rents in Wales, showing rents potentially by postcode or ward area. Rent Smart Wales already publishes a number of interactive dashboards using Microsoft Power BI, including dashboards of property and landlord registrations. So we see this as improving upon the data which Rent Smart Wales already publishes. This spatial map could display various types of information, such as the number of bedrooms in a property or by the EPC rating of a property, which could enable users to apply different filters onto their search when looking at average rents. If a map of average rents was made available, this could provide both current and prospective tenants with further information to enable them to make informed decisions when looking for a new rental property, or also to enable them to negotiate or challenge an asking price for a new let, or if they receive a rent notice. And finally, this section of the white paper explores the potential for future legislative changes, which would enable private renters who wish to challenge rent increases to ask for rent officers for a determination of rent and to provide a right to appeal to the Residential Property Tribunal. Spatial mapping of rent data could provide tenants with data used to challenge rent increases if the proposed rent was significantly above the local market average rent for that type of property, and if no clear justification or reason had been provided to support that rent notice. This next proposal in the white paper looks at improving the habitability of the private rented sector as one of the key factors of improving housing adequacy. The Renting Homes Act places a series of conditions which licence holders must abide to ensure a property is habitable. However, it can be unclear to current and to prospective tenants, and also to Rent Smart Wales, whether a property meets its requirements. We propose to introduce placing a requirement for licensees to update their Rent Smart Wales account annually to complete an annual property conditions record. This would confirm the requirements which are outlined here on the slide, which includes that a property has a valid gas safety certificate and electrical inspection conditions, that property inspections have been done in the property, and self-certification against hazards outlined in the fitness for habitation regulations, that a property has main-wired smoke alarms and carbon monoxide detectors. We propose that this record would be included on the database of information that Rent Smart Wales holds on properties, and either members of the public would either be able to request this information, or this information could form part of a public register. Although these conditions are already legally required to fulfil under the Renting Homes Act, evidence from Rent Smart Wales data on enforcement already shows that not all properties are meeting these requirements. So we see the benefit of introducing this condition record to include having better information on the properties actively being rented in the sector, and better monitoring of compliance with existing license conditions, and then also providing this information publicly to prospective tenants to provide them the reassurance that their properties comply with standards. This section of the white paper looks at the barriers that people face to renting in the private rented sector. The Green Paper evidence and the evidence submitted to the Seneth's Local Government and Housing Committee inquiry into the private rented sector highlighted barriers to renting in the private rented sector. The white paper looks at how we can remove these barriers as a way of improving the accessibility of the private rented sector, which is one of the factors of housing adequacy. So the first aspect of this part of the white paper looks at rent guarantors. In collaboration with local authorities, in the white paper, we are proposing to develop national guidance for the provision of a rent guarantor. Often a landlord or an agent will undertake a credit check of a prospective tenant, and in some cases when a prospective tenant may not meet this check, a landlord or an agent may ask for a UK guarantor to sign up to underwrite any non-payment of rent, or alternatively, sometimes a landlord or an agent may require a large payment of rent in advance, sometimes from 6 to 12 months. We are proposing to develop national guidance. The purpose of this guidance will be to develop a consistent approach and clear eligibility criteria to support local authorities in offering support to people who need to rent a property in the private rented sector, but who are unable to secure a UK guarantor. We also propose to set eligibility criteria in the white paper for those who may struggle to be able to secure a UK guarantor. Our aim from this is to ensure that more people are able to access a guarantor scheme, and therefore supporting them to secure accommodation. It is also anticipated that if a prospective tenant was able to secure a rent guarantor, then the landlord or agent wouldn't be justified in requiring a large payment of rent upfront to secure a tenancy. The second aspect of looking at barriers towards accessing the private rented sector is looking at the barriers faced to tenants with pets. Animal charities who responded to the Green Paper outlined that although a lot of households have pets, rental properties are often not advertised as pet friendly. Evidence from the Seneft's local government and housing committee into the private rented sector also outlined that a large number of people who handed over their dogs to rehoming centres the reason for that was due to a change in accommodation or rental agreement. So in order to address this potential barrier to people with pets accessing the private rented sector, we are considering in the white paper to make provision to allow a landlord to cover the cost of an additional premium on their insurance policy relating to pet damage as a permitted payment under the Renting Homes Act. And we are also seeking to encourage best practice by looking at amendments to the code of practice for licensed landlords and agents to promote a pets considered label to be included on letters details as a standard default within the code of practice. The final proposal in this section on fair rents focuses on the need to improve the supply of affordable homes, which is clearly a key part of progressing towards improving housing adequacy in Wales. And improving the supply of affordable homes was a key aspect of the evidence submitted to the Green Paper consultation. Some respondents to the Green Paper called for the Welsh Government to increase the supply of private rental property by providing a tax refund. However, of course, the Welsh Government advocates a model of social partnership, and therefore any reduction in tax receipts should essentially be something for something, and therefore for the wider benefit of the public and for those in society who need support. The Welsh Government has a national scheme called Leasing Scheme Wales, where funding is provided for local authorities to lease private dwellings from property owners at rental levels based on the local housing allowance rates. The local authority can then use these properties to house people who require affordable housing. In the white paper, we are gathering views on whether the Land Transaction Tax Act could be amended to provide a tax refund of the higher residential rates for those who buy a property and then enter a head lease with the local authority for a minimum of five years, for that local authority to then be the landlord under an affordable rental scheme. As part of our long-term commitment to ending homelessness, we are seeking to reduce our reliance on temporary accommodation, and increasing the supply of suitable long-term homes is a key aspect of this. And this concludes this section of the proposals in the fair rent section of the white paper. So, diolch yn fawr, thank you very much.
Thanks very much indeed, Lily, for that run through the provisions in respect of affordable rents. It's actually much easier to listen to than to read. So thank you very much. Can I ask the audience to put any questions or comments in the Q&A box ready for our session in about 10 minutes? And while you're doing that, I'd like to hand over to Darren Baxter, who's the housing lead at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. And I know, unlike many others over Offa's-Dyke, Darren actually has a keen eye and keen interest on matters in Wales. So Darren, over to you. What's the experience elsewhere on trying to make rents affordable?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I'll speak to that, and I'll tie it into maybe some wider thoughts on kind of rental reform. We'll talk mainly about England and Scotland, because there seems to be less going on in Northern Ireland, and just for pace and for time, so maybe a sort of GB look. And I think the sort of two broad observations would be one, that there is a fair amount of similarity, particularly when it comes to conversations around rent control. Like, I think the debate, particularly between Wales and Scotland, is fairly similar. I'll come on to that in a second. But more broadly, I think it's really interesting to see this focus on housing as a right. But there does seem to be perhaps a bit of a sort of a disconnect between the sort of political space that has opened up for discussions around sort of adequacy and rights, and potentially the risk that sort of Wales is being left behind a little bit by its sort of near neighbours in terms of certain recent reforms, particularly around sort of renters' rights and maybe even a sort of rent control debate. So what is happening? So starting with England, we have a new government, and the Renters' Rights Bill was introduced in late last year, so September last year, and will hopefully be passed this year. And this is a sort of big piece of legislation that will mean, some really fundamental changes to the rights afforded to private renters. It follows the Renters Reform Bill, which the previous Conservative government introduced, but which didn't pass before the election, largely as a result of pressure from backbench Conservative MPs. Though I think that it's worth saying that the reforms have broad cross-party support. And the bill is a long time coming. So it was first promised with a call for evidence in 2019. So it's long awaited, much debated. The bill itself is like pretty far-reaching. And it will end Section 21, or and sometimes referred to as no-fault evictions, although it's not quite true, and move away from fixed-term tenancy tenancies to kind of will basically get rid of fixed-term tenancies. It plans to ban discrimination, and so what that will do, just in practice, I think it's worth saying, is that will mean that sort of every tenancy will be not subject to a fixed term, will be open-ended, and to end it, landlords will have to prove a specific ground for eviction. So there will be no longer a sort of provision for a sort of just general no fault end of fixed term sort of eviction. They aim to ban discrimination against applications with children for potential rental applicants with children or those claiming benefits. There's a plan to introduce the decent home standard to the private rented sector. So basically, the decent home standard being, especially the equivalent to the, I'm going to get the title wrong, but the Welsh Housing Quality Standard. Currently, it doesn't quite apply to social housing in England, but homes are the social landlords are regulated against it. That will apply legally to the private rented sector, and all homes will need to meet that standard as a minimum. It'll establish an ombudsman and require landlords to register. And then on rents, which have specifically been asked about, it will do a number of things. Firstly, it's going to limit bidding wars by not allowing landlords to solicit bidding as part of the sort of application process. So it won't prevent tenants from offering a higher rent at the start of a tenancy in order to secure it. But what it will mean is that landlords have to firstly list what the rent actually is, which most do already, and then it will not allow them to enter into a sort of a process of like soliciting higher bids. They obviously they can take one if one is offered. Another thing it will do is limit rent in advance to 1 month. So there's been a shift, I think, in recent years, as particularly as like sort of some housing markets have become more constrained, that we've seen landlords asking for an increasingly large amount of months rent up in advance, or 6 months, up to say 6 months rent in advance. And obviously that's sort of pricing out those who have lower levels of savings, or those who can, can't sort of draw down on borrowing from family members or whatever else. So that'll be limited to only 1 month in advance. And then the biggest biggest offer on rental affordability, I guess, is that they will move to a system where rent increases are limited to once a year, and that they will follow a fixed process. And there will also be a sort of renewed process of being able to challenge those rents where they're deemed to be unreasonable. So it will cap rent increases to the market rent and allow tenants to challenge what they perceive to be unreasonable increases, so beyond that market level, at the first tier tribunal. And the hope that, government's hope with this is that will be a way for, what sort of tenants groups and organisations like JRF have been warning both the past and current government about, is you can get rid of Section 21, you can desire to get rid of no-fault evictions, but if landlords can just hike the rent, it's effectively an eviction by the back door. And this has been the offer back, effectively, as a way of navigating that. I think that the similar challenges to those in Wales around data will apply, and I think it's really interesting to kind of hear the sort of proposals in the white paper for that. It's worth saying that the government have really ruled out pretty firmly going further on rent control. And that's despite pressure from some. So most prominently, the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, has been arguing under the last government for powers to cap rents in London pretty vociferously, and has backed various bits of research, commissioned various bits of research looking into that, and has made that quite a big sort of part of his campaigning. it's worth saying that since the colour of the government changed, he has gone a little bit quieter on that topic, but I'm sure that's unrelated. There is also pressure, I think, from sort of tenants groups locally, from some other sort of local leaders, but it feels currently that there is, not a huge amount of political backing for the idea of rent control. Overall, I think it's worth saying we think the bill is, really positive move. It'll be a massive step change in renters' rights. We would want to see a few areas tightened, so like a tougher stance on no-fault evictions, for example, but also we want to see further action on rents. So we think that an in-tenancy rent cap, so capping rent at, say, an increase of either CPI or earnings growth, or whichever is the lower in any given year, would be a preferable way of managing that risk that rent increases are used as a backdoor eviction. And we think that's the case because effectively we know that tenants generally don't have a huge amount of knowledge about their rights and are often not sort of exercising the rights they've already got, and therefore like we think it's like sort of it's likely that like a large proportion of tenants will just simply not go to the first tier tribunal, so much simpler to cap rents through that process. So Scotland, then, thinking about Scotland, is much further ahead than England and the rest of the UK in reforming renting. So they introduced a very similar set of reforms in 2016 and they were implemented in 2017. And this introduced the private residential tenancy, which similarly kind of ended Section 21 and introduced, moved away from fixed terms and introduced new grounds for eviction. They limited, rent increases and had a very similar process for allowing tenants to challenge unfair rent increases. They introduced longer notice periods. But the thing that they did do was go much further on rent control. And they introduced the capacity for ministers to create rent pressure zones, which would effectively be like local areas and like sort of housing market area levels that could control rents in some way. But since the bill was implemented in 2017, no rent pressure zones have actually been implemented. And interestingly, given the debate about data, and I'll come back to this, that is one of the reasons like local government have cited for why it hasn't been possible to do that. This debate has then been like sort of reignited recently because in last year they passed the Housing Scotland Bill 2024, which brought the sort of rent control debate back to the fore, particularly sort of after pressure from the Green Party, who were at the time in coalition with the SNP. And that will require local authorities to assess rental conditions at least every 5 years. And it gives them a duty to assess basically whether they need to create a rent pressure zone. And it will give a greater ability for the Scottish Government to designate one. There is a sort of an amendment coming up that will to be debated, which would cap rents in those rent pressure zones at CPI plus 1% up to an overall cap of 6% a year. So basically that will be your annual increase and it will be both within and between tenancies. And then now a lot of the debate is focused on implementation. So which properties will be exempt from rent control? For example, would new build be exempt? Would private rented properties owned by social landlords be exempt? Would those that have been refurbished or retrofit be exempt, for example? And there's going to be another consultation in spring 2025. It's worth saying, I think, that the reaction from the housing sector and local authorities has been pretty critical. And there's a bit of a tension between sort of politicians from particularly parties like the Green Party in Scotland and tenants groups who are really positive and keen to see action on rent control. And then some of the sector who are sort of pushing back, which I guess is quite interesting in the context of the consultation responses around like the potential risks of a rent control. So I think the like lessons from Scotland there are that like Wales is definitely right to identify a lack of data as a problem, and it's definitely held back like the implementation of rent controls. And the similarity is I think there's going to be a lot of consultation in Scotland before anything actually happens. So this sort of, to use your phrasing, Victoria, of rights later, seems to be very similar in terms of the Scottish rent control debate. So to cap off, I think I'll sort of remake those 2 points. I think there is space probably for Wales to be much bolder than it currently is being on rental reform outside of rent control and potentially with reference to rent control as well. And there could be a much like bolder focus on security and quality. And that rent control, and my second point would be that rent control is a debate across the UK, and that tension between sort of renters and politicians, seems to be playing out in a similar way. And I think just my sort of concluding thought on that would be, when we think about what delivering quality housing and adequate housing for people means, I think we need to take, we obviously need to be thinking about rights, and we need to be thinking about regulation and legislation as part of that. But we also need to think about the structural conditions. And the big challenge, I think, in the rent control debate is that we get tied up in the sort of what sort of impact will this have on the market, and particularly on the sort of type of landlord we have, which is this sort of reliance on this quite sort of amateur sector currently. And I think we need to be thinking much more about the models of housing provision, like who provides rental accommodation, which will mean much more social housing, but it might also mean thinking about like what is the sort of rental offer for people who are probably not going to get social housing, people on sort of middle incomes, for example, and thinking about, what are the structural elements to delivering decent housing beyond just rights and regulation as well. Because I think otherwise we get stuck in a point where, much more progressive or bold action on renters reform, for example, is held back by, or almost held hostage to, by this sort of the nature of the sector as it stands.
Thanks very much indeed, Darren. I think it's really helpful to hear about the different approaches in England and in Scotland, and that there's in some ways they've perhaps been going a bit further than we have in Wales, and yet in other ways I think Wales is probably starting in the right way, particularly in respect of data. So that's been really helpful, and we've also had lots of questions come in. I'm going to try and split them into two. So pick up first of all questions about adequacy, and then come back and then look at about not adequacy, about the quality of the housing, and then look at the affordability. So one of the questions that's come in, and I'll probably start with you, Lily, on this, is does the proposal around self-certification put the burden of regulation onto the tenant? If landlords provide inaccurate information, who else would be responsible for identifying that but the tenant? And how can that work if the power imbalance between tenant and landlord created by no-fault evictions isn't addressed? So, Lily, I mean, does it put the burden on the tenant?
Thank you. So I guess the first thing to say is it's really important to emphasise that these are already legal requirements under the Renting Homes Act that landlords and agents should already be abiding by. So with the annual property condition record, if they are already following the law, having an annual property condition record to self-certify is essentially a ticking of a box that you're already fulfilling the legal requirements you should be doing. So in terms of the enforcement of that, Rent Smart Wales has enforcement powers. It's a licensed condition to fulfil these requirements. So there are consequences for self-certifying with an annual property condition record if those things haven't been done as well. In terms of burden on the tenant, I wouldn't say that it adds burden onto the tenant. I think what it does do is it adds transparency into the sector, where if the landlord or an agent has self-certified that they are compliant with these requirements and they haven't, it could potentially add transparency and enable the tenant to be able to counter when they have faced difficulties in their rental property, and to have that documentation that shows that they've said they are compliant, and to be able to raise raise these issues to the landlord. But I wouldn't say that is putting the burden on the tenant, because it's a legal requirement of the landlord or the agent.
Okay, and if I could follow up with another question while your mic's still on, Lily. So another contributor says, although the benefit of self-declaring if a property is suitable and has the correct certification in place is positive, what proposals would there be for enforcement for those who don't do it annually? Could this potentially become an administrative burden? Not quite sure who for, perhaps Rent Smart Wales, I don't know, and who would pay for it? And if tenants had problems, again, asking the previous question, who would they complain to? And could the public self-certification be edited by Rent Smart Wales if it wasn't correct?
Again, Rent Smart Wales have enforcement powers, and these requirements are a licence condition. So the consequence of not complying with that could be having your licence revoked. And then Rent Smart Wales also publishes the dashboard information of landlords and agents who have had their licence revoked, and there is live information available of the enforcement activity that Rent Smart Wales has. In terms of the second aspect of the question, which was on, sorry, could you repeat what the second part of the question
I've got to find it
was?
now.
Yeah, it was.
So
Oh,
would it be an administrative burden, and who would pay for it?
I guess again, administrative, I guess from the perspective of a landlord and agent, these should already be things that are already being done. So I can't imagine self-certifying by having that information uploaded onto Rent Smart Wales would be a large administrative requirement. But then additionally, from the perspective of Rent Smart Wales, there is already, data collection that Rent Smart Wales does, as part of their functions. So it could be, a similar part of the data that Rent Smart Wales already collects on properties being rented in the sector. So it's an improvement of those existing functions.
Okay, I'm going to come on to Darren in a moment, but just an observation from me. I mean, it seems as if a lot of the proposals in the white paper are based on the assumption that tenants have choice, and you only have to look on local social media to see that people are desperate for homes. And I think it would be, people will accept far below standard properties now, and I think that sort of choice premise is about a different world. Darren, what about standards of properties in England and Scotland? What do you think? Are we putting the burden on tenants in Wales?
I think so. Well, I think there are probably two things. So one, which is that I think if England is successful in bringing in the decent home standard as a minimum standard for renting, there will just be a very different regulatory like the level of standards that homes are required to be at to be legally let to private tenants will just be very different. They'll go from being a very minimum, basically this house won't kill you standard, to something that is much more linked to what we would commonly regard as like a decent minimum quality. So I think there is that. I think anything that like sort of requires tenants to do stuff suffers both in a world where you haven't got as expansive security of tenure as you might want, so people don't want to upset their landlords, and we know from research we've done with tenants over a number of years that that's definitely like keeping your landlord sweet is a motivating factor. But also, like, I think there are, particularly if you have an infrastructure around registration anyway, putting as much of the onus on landlords is optimal. And I think this is about we're having about the sort of regulation in England, for example, where still the proposal currently is that tenants would be able to complain to their local authority or to an ombudsman if their house didn't meet that standard. We think it should be flipped around, and that actually, a landlord, in order to register that property, the owner should be on them to basically prove that it has met the standards. And that way we think that's not just like sort of beneficial in terms of resetting that power balance where tenants might not complain. It also just is much more efficient, and it saves on a whole load of regulatory a load of enforcement from local authorities or others, which we already know is like strained because of budget pressures and also just not always as effective as it should be.
Okay, I want to ask pick up a couple of questions about rent control. There's one here that says the white paper advises it is not looking at bringing in rent control at this time. Is there a plan for the future? And then follows that comment up with the introduction of the Renting Homes Act. Saw many private rented sector landlords sell up and leave the sector, they claim, due to the increased restrictions on them. And the person commenting says that the white paper is likely to increase that. So how can we ensure current landlords remain and even attract new ones? I think that's a debatable comment, but certainly, Lily, if you'd certainly ask it, you know, is there a plan to look at rent controls in the future?
With the evidence that we received to the Green Paper, you know, we saw that you know, the decision to rule out rent control was both on, you know, the consideration of the impact that it could have on the supply of private rental properties, but also as well of the potential detrimental impacts on the tenant as well. And some of the, you know, the examples that I've used, such as you know, the evidence supplied from the Green Paper, such as that if there was a rent cap put in place, could that be seen as a target, and it would, you know, impact the way that the market would respond to a rent control or a rent cap. So the decision, you know, was taken not to pursue a rent control. Sorry, could you repeat the second half of that question as well? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm scrolling through them, so let me just find it. So it says about the loss of supply, that what should be done to address the a possible loss of supply because of the provisions.
I mean, Rent Swap Wales publishes data on the turnover of landlord and agent registrations and also property registrations, and what the trends shows from Rent Swap Wales is that although landlords may leave the sector, the properties remain in the sector. So it is, you know, it is essentially that these properties are then being purchased by other people who are then joining the sector as landlords. So the remaining stock stays the same. So there is no evidence from the data we have that there has been an impact on the supply in the private rented sector.
That's been our experience too. We were looking at land transaction tax statistics recently, and they showed that in some parts of Wales, round about 1 in 5 property purchases are for buy-to-let. So there's clearly still an appetite there. Can I come on to rent controls now and pick up a really interesting question, which is which of the proposals in the fair rent and affordability section do you think will actually improve affordability? And goes on to say, this feels like a significant gap right now. And in the white paper, it's even acknowledged that proposals like Rent Challenge can't address the problem. So what exactly, if anything, is there about affordability?
Thank you. So the section in the white paper on improving data on market rents looks specifically, you know, at improving our understanding of affordability in the sector. And there are clearly two aspects of that proposal. One is it's useful for policymakers. It's useful for the Welsh Government to have an understanding of the affordability challenges in the sector, especially at a localised level. And then also as well, useful for the tenant or a prospective tenant to have publicly available information on what the average rents are, especially as well with the proposal with the spatial mapping of rents to be able to add filters to add the kind of the contextual information on properties, such as like the amount of bedrooms and the EPC certificate. In terms of improving affordability, it will add transparency in the sector and provide tenants with that further information to be able to see what the average actually is, rather than compared to when we look at information on Rightmove and Zoopla, that's an asking rent and it isn't reflective necessarily of the sector. Tenants do have, you know, the ability to actually challenge a rent, you know, as a prospective tenant as well. If a landlord, you know, if to be able to challenge or negotiate a lower rent as well, that is something that a tenant is able to do.
Okay. In theory, maybe. I'm sure, certainly my own knowledge and experiences are that that's actually quite difficult if you want to keep your home as well. I mean, Darren, do you think there's more scope that that can be learned in Wales? What can we learn from England and Scotland, given we are where we are with the green paper, white paper process?
You should probably learn from England to not do whatever England is doing if you want more affordable housing. It would be a good starting point. I think in fairness to the Welsh Government, one of the big levers for addressing the affordability challenge is the local housing allowance, and the fact that that is being frozen in cash terms and not keeping pace with the actual cost of rents And that being a lever that sits at the UK level is really problematic, I think. And so more lobbying and pressure from the Welsh Government and the Welsh housing sector alongside the stuff we're doing with colleagues, I think is really important there. But I think, when we look at why, for example, Scotland has lower poverty rates, why it has greater affordability, it comes down to like the quite simple fact that they have plentiful and cheap social housing. And I think that's sort of thing, it's something that's within the gift of the Welsh Government is meeting its house building targets around social housing, expanding them, making sure there are kind of cheap rented homes available for people who need them. I think that is like a key at the core of this, like that will be a thing that helps you really make inroads in meeting the affordability challenge.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'm going to draw to a close by just asking our panelists to each just say 2 sentences, and I'm going to be fierce, 2 sentences about where one good thing that they like about the white paper, and I won't ask the Welsh Government officials to say one thing they think could do better, but both of you, could you pick out one? So I'll start with Einion, then Ruth, then Lily, and then Darren. So Einion, what do you think is the big strength of the white paper?
I think it provides a very clear way forward, clarity maybe for the sector, and also for the incoming government afterwards. We'll have to consider it, but I think it does provide clarity. It shows the sector what we're looking to do, but also just to remind everyone that this is a consultation. So these are proposals, and we will be taking very, very seriously what people have to say, because we really value the evidence that you have and the experiences you can draw on.
Thank you very much. Ruth, one thing you like and just one thing that you'd change?
What I like is that I think the white paper, it tries hard to demonstrate that it is responding to the request for right to adequate housing, which shows that it's gained considerable traction, I suppose, as a campaign. So that's positive for us. One thing I would change, I would put the word right in the title. I would bring it back to that right to adequate housing. And
Great. Well, of course you would. That's lovely. Lily, what do you think is one of the strengths of the white paper?
Thank you. I think the fair rents section of the white paper has a range of different interventions looking at affordability, habitability, and then also the accessibility of the private rented sector, looking at the different barriers, and then also as well the efforts in the white paper as well to address how we can improve affordable supply of housing. So I think the second half of the white paper has a lot of the kind of short to medium interventions of how we can look to improve the sector.
Great, thank you. And Darren, you actually get the last word. One thing you like and one thing you change.
Well, I think like Wales is the only part of the UK that seems to be having a meaningful debate about the right to housing. So I like that it kind of continues to push that debate along in a tangible way. And I think on a weakness or an addition, I think there is just so much lower hanging fruit that advances the right to housing that could just be part of this without having to wait for further developing a strategy, particularly around tenure security and housing quality.
Well, that was much shorter and sweeter than I was expecting, and as a result, we have finished on time. I'd like to thank our panelists very much indeed for coming along and exposing themselves to questions from me, but more importantly, from the audience here. As Einion said, the white paper is open to consultation. It's open till Friday, the 31st. So do please get your views in. We will, if you haven't seen it already, we will put a link to the consultation when we send round the recording of today's session. Thank you very much indeed once again to our panelists. Thank you also to the audience for staying with us and for some great questions. I'm sorry I couldn't get to them all, but thanks. Bye now.